good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Janani Subbiah, and today we're going to be talking about code review etiquettes. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to say thank you to all our sponsors: ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Redspire, Agilisys, and Hitachi Solutions. A little more about me before we get into code review etiquettes. My name is Janani, and I currently work as a product architect for a company called Detroit Labs based in Detroit, Michigan, USA. I love to read and travel. Given how 2020 went, I've been doing a lot more reading and absolutely no traveling, like probably a majority of the rest of the world. And I'm also a newbie balcony gardener, where I've been trying to grow fruits, vegetables, and herbs in my small balcony space, and it's been a lot of fun. It's been more of an experiment for me because I try to grow these things from store-bought produce versus buying the seeds from someplace. Just because that's how this whole thing started out for me, and I cannot wait for summer of this year to try and grow more vegetables and fruits from store-bought produce. So on that note, we're going to be talking about code reviews today. But first up, we'll start off with the importance of etiquette, especially in the context of code reviews. And then we'll talk about a bunch of etiquettes for reviewers to keep in mind as they're reviewing code. Next, we'll get into some team etiquette items. These are more things that teams could do ahead of time to make sure that code reviews can be done more thoroughly, successfully, and code review comments can be received in a positive and thoughtful light. And finally, we'll end with some author etiquettes. So on that note, let's first talk about the importance of etiquette. I guess when it comes to etiquette, it's one of those things that's important in just about every walk of life, but it's all the more important when it comes to a non-verbal mode of communication like code reviews. And to illustrate this point, I am going to lean on Albert Mehrabian's book, which is titled Silent Messages, Implicit Communication of Emotions and Attitudes. And in this book, Albert Mehrabian talks about the different components that make conversations conversations involving emotions and feelings more successful. And here is a split up. There are three big things that drive how successful one can have conversations that involve feelings and emotions. And those three things are: verbal liking contributes to 7% of the successfulness of such conversations. And verbal liking includes things like the words we use to actually have such a conversation. Next is the vocal liking, which refers to things like what pitch is our voice at as we are speaking, what tone do we use, and things like that. And this contributes to 38% of the effectiveness of such communications. And finally, we have facial liking, which contributes to the bulk of the effectiveness of such communications, and it comes in at a 55%. So if we were to take this and apply this to a non-verbal mode of communication like code reviews, we don't have access to vocal liking there. Neither do we have access to facial liking because it's all words exchanged on a PR or a code review, right? We only have access to those words which comes from verbal liking. So we have access to 7% of what drives conversations of feelings and emotions to make up for the entire 93%. And this 7% needs to be used in such a way that, it ensures that what is said is received in positive light and is thoughtful. So etiquette is important in every walk of life, but is even more important with regards to code reviews because it's non-verbal in nature. So on that note, let's look at some reviewer etiquettes, things that reviewers of code reviews need to keep in mind as they're reviewing code. The first one I'd like to talk about today is for reviewers to keep in mind that it is not an author review. And what I mean by that is when you're reviewing some code, it is important to review the code that has been put up for a code review and not the author or the group of authors who put it up. In an ideal world, we all would probably like each other or get along with each other the exact same way in life and, I guess when it comes to workplace. But, sometimes that's not always the case. So for times like that and for other times, it is important to make sure that we are reviewing the important thing here. We are reviewing the code and not the author. There was a study that was conducted in 2017. And the title of the study is Gender Differences and Bias in Open Source, Pull Request Acceptance of Women versus Men. And I think this study is very, very relevant to this particular reviewer etiquette. The study has a bunch of observations. One of the most interesting ones, or one of the ones I found very interesting, was this. The study found that women on an average had an acceptance rate of their pull requests of 78.7%, while for men it was 74.6%. And this back in 2017 didn't really make sense. I don't think it still makes sense, but with everything happening in our industry and with everything I was reading, this was very surprising when I saw this for the first time. And I kept reading through their observations, and one of the things they have called out within the context of what we're talking about today is this statement here. I'm just going to read the one in bold. It says that women's acceptance rates are higher only when they are not identifiable as women. And I guess this basically explained everything to me. And making sure that we are not reviewing an author and we're actually reviewing the code doesn't solve this problem overnight. But I think it helps all of us to take that single small step towards solving this problem on a long-term basis. And we can all start with our teams and the code that we review. So let's all make sure that we are reviewing the code and not the author behind that code. The next one for reviewers is to make sure that we're using questions instead of commands when we're suggesting or requesting for changes on code reviews. So say, for instance, as a reviewer, I have a change request. Rather than doing one of these things, basically rather than saying change it or don't do this, which could make the author or anybody else reading this review either really get angry or feel like hell's broken loose and I'm really mad about it. If I were to use something like could this be changed, what this effectively does is takes the focus away from a tone that someone could decide to give my written statement, for lack of a better term, and it puts the focus on this change suggestion itself. So this makes anybody who's reading this think about the suggestion, think about what that means for the code, rather than making somebody associate a certain tone to what's said and basically implying things from that. So using questions instead of commands, I found is very helpful. The next one is almost obvious, and I'm sure a lot of us do this already, is to make sure that we're providing additional context as we are asking for changes on code reviews. So this includes links to resources. If you're using a third-party library and your change basically pertains to that library, making sure that you're linking out to documentation. And this could also be linking out to forums where probably the answer is more in-depth explained or more well explained. And if you're lucky, those resources might also mention what are some things that are not to be done. Maybe things to avoid or other things to keep in mind as we're making these changes. And finally, I think this is very helpful, not just with regards to the current code review that's where these conversations are happening, but it also helps the author and other people who are looking at this take these things to other sections of the code and other code reviews that they do. And overall, this will eventually ensure consistency across your code base. The next one for reviewers is to make sure that we always keep in mind the scope of the review. Because sometimes it's very easy to request changes just by looking at the review and not really understanding what the scope of the review is, and also not really understanding what our change requests may lead to. Maybe it's a bunch of broken tests that is very easy to overlook on the first look. And scope creep is a very, very real thing. So make sure to avoid that as you are doing code reviews. Make sure to keep the scope of the review in mind all the time. This is great, but sometimes if there are suggestions or change requests or other things that you feel like you absolutely have to say on a code review, maybe make the suggestion, but find out from the author or other people on the team if they think this falls within the scope of the review. And in the case that it doesn't, offer to make additional cards. Maybe you have the additional context information around the actual change being suggested, where you can put all of those into a card that somebody can work on at a later time. And this one is really easy because most code review tools are very good about highlighting sections that have changed. For instance, GitHub highlights sections that have been added in green and the ones that have been deleted in red. So it's very easy to know and understand what sections have actually changed in the code. But the other thing to keep in mind is to make sure that you're only reviewing those changed sections and not reviewing sections that haven't unchanged. Especially if you're going to be requesting changes on a certain unchanged section just because the author is there, maybe it's good to take a step back, hold on to your suggestion and maybe make a card for it, unless it's going to be a very minor change. So that's something to keep in mind. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, sometimes it's just easier to talk to one another face to face rather than have back and forth, be it on a messaging tool or sometimes on PRs. When such things happen, it's important to make sure that whatever offline conversation happened is documented in the code review itself. And what I mean by offline conversations are just conversations that don't happen as messages on code reviews. And the important thing here is to make sure that anybody else who's looking at that code gets that additional context that happened in the form of offline conversations, because that makes sure that everybody's time is better used, because nobody is now confused about why these changes were made. Because they are not missing any context. And if you're like me and you forget a lot of the conversations that happen, especially the ones that happen offline, documenting them within the context of a code review will ensure that it's there forever, and you can always go back and revisit that comment, and it will definitely serve as a very, very good future reference, and your future self will be thankful to your past self for doing this. The next reviewer etiquette, in my opinion, is a pretty minor change, but it has a pretty big impact. In fact, it's one of those things that has an impact at a much deeper level rather than at the surface. Using the word we instead of you. So if I had a change request on, say, a code review, and what I decided to say was this: you should update this to the latest version available. And again, depending on the mood of the author, or depending on whoever is reading this, and depending on how they choose to read this, this can be perceived as, maybe blaming, or maybe even finger pointing, like, why don't you do this? And that doesn't really sit well with everybody, right? Instead, if I were to remove the word you and use the word we instead, this would read, we should update this to the latest version available. And what this does is puts the focus back on the fact that the code base is shared, and it is up to the team as a whole to make sure that it has clean patterns, it has good architecture, and it's kept up, in a clean, it's clean and pristine, and it's up to the team to maintain that. It brings a sense of inclusivity, and it also brings a sense of we're all in this together. It reinforces that team sense. It's a small change, but I think it has a very big impact. The next one, I think this is something that not all of us fall into the trap of, but some of us do, and it's not very intentional. It's very easy to jump into a code review, especially if your code review tool and your project management tool are two different tools. It's very easy to jump into the code review, look at the code, make sure everything looks good, make sure all the variables are named appropriately and all of those nice things, and approve it or request for changes and be out. But I think it'll be helpful if all reviewers went one step, took that additional step to actually review the card that the code changes are being made for. And the obvious thing to make sure here is to ensure that the acceptance criteria in the card is actually met by the code changes that are being made. And the less obvious, but one of the, I think, very important ones to make sure is to ensure that the changes in the code are not unaccounted for. And what I mean by that is there are no change requests happening in the code that haven't been accounted for in the card itself. And I say this because this makes tracking things very easy. For instance, hell breaks loose and you want to figure out which card caused the issue. Having that one-on-one mapping between what's in the card and what's in the code is helpful, especially for non-developers to be able to trace back what went wrong and where. So make sure that there's a one-on-one mapping between what's called out in the card and what's in the code. And if that doesn't happen, maybe, add the additional things that the code might be doing into the card, or make a separate card and link it to the current PR too. Sometimes that's an option too, depending on how big the changes are. The next one is to make sure that you're calling out suggestions explicitly. And what I mean by this is, if you're making a suggestion, and by suggestion I'm saying not a change request, but things that maybe you would do a little differently, but the author can choose to take that suggestion or leave it. If you have things like that, make sure that the author and other people on the team know that you're only making a suggestion and not asking for a change request. At Detroit Labs, we like to use symbols for this. We use the cake emoji. So if I were to make a suggestion on a code review, it would look something like this. I would have a cake emoji followed by the actual suggestion, which here reads, what are your thoughts on adding some documentation to this method? And when somebody sees this, the intention is they would read this and they would know that this is only a suggestion, so they can think about it and they can choose to do it or not. But it is not something that stops the pull request or the code review from being approved. If you're like the past me and you're wondering why we use the cake emoji, here is a fun fact. The cake without the suggestion is a perfectly good cake. The code in its current form is similar to the cake here that doesn't have the icing, and the icing itself is like the suggestion. Like, it probably adds a little bit to the cake, but the cake in itself can be had as is. The icing is not required. So that is a fun fact about why this particular emoji was chosen. The other option is obviously to explicitly say that you're suggesting this. So I like to use these words for that. I like to say something along the lines of, I do not feel strongly about this, but what do you think about adding some documentation here? And I like this because this explicitly conveys that this is only a suggestion, and the author can choose to, either add some documentation or not in this case. The other thing I like about both these options, or calling out suggestions in general, is I think it opens the door to some good conversations versus just having to make a change or having to just talk about the change. Because everything is phrased as a question here, I think it's very easy for people to start talking about what it means to make that change. And I found those to be very productive almost all the time these have happened. The next reviewer etiquette is to make sure to do it right, or rather to do thorough reviews as early in the process as possible. And I've specifically said the 0th time here because everything in our world is 0 indexed. And what I mean by this is sometimes code reviews don't go up, are immediately approved and merged. Sometimes they go through changes, or rather more often than not, they're going through multiple changes, as people come in, review, and ask for change requests. And as this happens, say a code review has been changed about 5 times, has gone through 5 different sets of changes, and a reviewer decides to come in at that point and decides to ask for a change request in a section of the code that has remained unchanged through those 5 times. This is very frustrating, and it's also not fair to the author and their time. So it's important to make sure that we're all doing reviews as thoroughly as possible. And as much as possible, let's all avoid asking for change requests in sections of the code review that haven't changed. This can be very hard, especially when it comes to long reviews. So if you're having to do long reviews, my suggestion is to take a break and not to try and get through them in one go. Again, I understand that this is not easy, but I feel like maybe trying to do this is much better than just trying to get through all of them in one single go, and it's hard to be thorough when you have to do that. I like to do 3 or 5 files at a time, depending on how big the files are, and also taking the time to test it thoroughly. Just taking the time to do it right as early on in the process as possible is very helpful. So this reviewer etiquette is probably my most favorite, or probably one of those things that I wish I had realized early on in my career. Remembering that no suggestion is ever too small to be made, or no question is invalid. It doesn't matter who is asking the question. Everybody's questions and opinions absolutely matters. Doesn't matter where you are in your career or just who you are or whatnot. If you have a question or a suggestion, it's important to make sure that you're bringing it up. On my first ever team, I was put on absolutely every single code review. Actually, the whole team had to review all the code that would get merged, and so I ended up being put on a bunch of reviews, which was great. It was probably an amazing exposure, to get access to something like that. But the thing I did not do correctly was I never brought up any of my questions or suggestions. Not that I didn't have any, I had too many of them. But I never brought anything up, and the only reason for that was because I had more excuses than the questions and suggestions I had. I was full of excuses like, maybe this other person has already thought about it. This other person has been on the team for a really long time. If nobody else is saying anything, then I'm not going to say anything. I haven't been here for a long time. I don't think I know enough. And I'm just starting out in my career. And the list was endless. I just had like so many excuses, and every single time I want to say something, one of these excuses would come up. I would give in and absolutely not say anything. It wasn't until much later that I realized that it didn't really matter. None of those excuses were valid. None of those excuses actually mattered. The important thing there was I was given an opportunity to actually voice my opinion and bring up my questions, and I didn't use it because of excuses I had made to myself. So if there's one thing I'd like to tell my past self, it is probably this: make sure to bring those questions and suggestions up. And obviously there is no harm in asking or suggesting, right? And if there is somebody else on the team who has the same question as you, one, they'll get their question answered, and number two, seeing you voice your opinions or bring up questions might also empower them to do the same. So if you have any questions or suggestions, especially on code reviews, definitely make sure to bring it up. The next one for reviewers, again, one of the, I guess, a little obvious ones is to make sure to realize that code reviews are a two-way street. And what I mean by that is code reviews are not a place where a bunch of reviewers come in and just keep making requests for changes in the code. It's a place to also ask for feedback on your suggestion as a reviewer. So I like to ask for feedback on my suggestions like this: I think we could pull in this library for doing this computation. What do you think? And the what do you think part is where I'm actually asking for feedback on my suggestion. And the other thing I like to do is to find out if I'm missing something. This becomes really obvious if it's a big code base where there are multiple moving components, and it is not possible, or it's really hard to know about everything in depth. So for cases like that, I like to explicitly find out if I'm missing something after I make my suggestion, because it's possible that maybe I don't have a full picture, and I genuinely want to find out what I'm missing so that I'll know. Again, both these things, similar to some of the previous suggestions, open the door to good conversations on the team, and they're very productive conversations. So I would definitely encourage reviewers to ask for feedback and find out if you're missing something when you have a suggestion that you aren't too sure about. The next one for reviewers is to appreciate. I'm sure a lot of teams do this, I'm sure a lot of people do this, but if you see good code, good work, good patterns, good architecture, make sure to appreciate. Code reviews don't have to be a place where you're just making sure everything looks good, but it's also a place to make sure that you're saying you think everything looks good. I like to use emojis for this. Again, depending on the tool you use or depending on how you like to express your appreciation, make sure to get it out there. Make sure the author knows that you're appreciating their work and you think really highly of whatever they've put out there in the code review. This makes people rewarded, and that leads to a very healthy team morale. So on that note, I've reached the end of my reviewer etiquettes. Next, we're going to be talking about some team etiquettes. And these are things that teams could do mostly ahead of time, and maybe have it documented in their project charter or documents as such to ensure that the stage is set for good code review etiquette. The first one is to make sure that teams are using pull request templates. This is applicable probably more in the context of GitHub, and here is an example of a pull request template that we use. It has a bunch of questions that the author of the pull request is going to fill out before they hit the button and actually make the pull request. The first question is what this PR does. This is mostly a very high level explanation of what the PR does, and it's probably something along the lines of added this feature to our code base. And next, we get into more implementation specific details, like what were the components that were updated, were tests updated, what else changed in the code itself. And then we have testing steps. We have screenshots too, and just make sure that these screenshots don't include any security related information. So be aware of that if you plan to use screenshots in your pull request templates. And finally, there's a testing checklist. And this testing checklist is mostly for the author, and it's just a checklist that they can use to go through to make sure they've done everything before they put the PR up. And this pull request template is very helpful because one, it tells the author exactly what needs to be communicated to reviewers for them to be successful in doing their code review. And number two, it also gives reviewers everything they'll need from the pull request itself to be able to do code reviews more successfully. So coming up with and finalizing a pull request template is very helpful. The next one for teams is to make sure and keep track of pre or post code review tasks. And depending on your role with regards to a code review, this could change. If you are a reviewer, a sample reviewer task is to make sure that the card that you're reviewing probably gets moved into the appropriate column, maybe before you do the review, as you're doing the review, or after you do the review. And if you are an author, it could be things like making sure that you have the right GitHub label for your PR if you're using GitHub, and making sure to request for changes, making sure to request for re-reviews on reviews maybe after you've made changes and somebody has already approved them. So things like that are very helpful. This ensures that everybody on the team, or rather the people who are going to be reviewing a PR, know the urgency of a PR. For example, say you're using GitHub and you're using labels on your PRs, putting the right labels there will tell people if it's something that needs to be reviewed immediately or not, so that it's not sitting there while it's something that needs to probably get merged into your main branch immediately. So again, it sets up the stage for good communication on PRs. This one, I think, is very helpful for teams to do before they even get started with code reviews. Coming up with and finalizing the number of approvals that will be required before a particular code review can be merged and deployed. Two obvious options are to have your entire team review every single PR, or you can have any one person, it doesn't have to be a particular person, but any one person approve a PR, and that would be sufficient for it to be merged. Well, this is definitely a balance, right? Several factors go into determining what that number looks like for you and your team. It could be the team size. If you have a really big team, maybe it doesn't make too much sense to have everybody review every single PR. Maybe it's a balance there. Maybe it's 2 people, 3 people, again, depending on your team size. The size of the code base. How big is your code base? How many people are really familiar with everything? Or do you have people who are more familiar with specific sections of the code base? And similarly, legacy portions. How many of them are legacy portions, and how many people actually know what's going on there? Is there one particular person who needs to look at changes that are being made to the legacy portions? Those are important questions to take into consideration before you finalize how many approvals need to be on a PR before it can be merged. And this is one of those less obvious things, keeping in mind that code reviews take time too. Again, if it's a big feature work, or if it's a big code change, don't forget that to review that code also takes a lot of time. So as you're planning your sprint, if you do Agile, it's important to make sure that you are taking into consideration the time it will take for you to actually review all the work, and not just taking into consideration the time it takes for all the implementation. This, over the course of time, ensures really good code quality because you are giving everybody the chance to review code thoroughly as early as possible in the process. And it leads to lower tech debt because your code quality is going up and you're catching and fixing issues, and you're mostly, I hope, not postponing fixing issues to a later time, because you actually have the time to do it correctly and to review it correctly. And the most important etiquette for teams, and probably the really very, very important one, is to make sure to diffuse toxic behavior. So toxic behavior in general needs to be diffused. It doesn't have to be within the context of code reviews, but With the context of code reviews, if you see any unhelpful, rude, or sarcastic comments, it doesn't matter if you're the author or the reviewer. If you're somebody on the team or if you see something like this, please be sure to step in and diffuse such toxic behavior. Make sure to provide feedback to the person who's posting those comments. Let them know that this is not okay. There are several really good talks and blogs on giving and receiving feedback. I would definitely recommend maybe reading through some of them before you do this. But don't let this slip because it's not okay. And follow up with comments. Make sure the author doesn't feel like they're being blamed for something, or make sure the author is not singled out. Because again, this is a team, and it's never one person versus the other. It's this entire team always together. The next set of etiquettes we're going to be talking about are author etiquettes. These are things that authors of code reviews need to keep in mind as they're putting up their code for review. The first one is the flip of the first reviewer etiquette we saw. And this one is for authors to remember that you are not your code. This was really hard for me when I started in the software industry. I remember that my first ever code review, I received about 33 comments, and it was really not a big change. It was a minor change, and all the comments, some of the best ones I've received, and I've learned so many lessons from that single code review. But it was really hard for me to read through them and actually, get started on making the changes because I was taking all of them really personally. I kept thinking I was not cut out for the software industry, or that I should just quit my career in software engineering because I received 33 comments on my code review. What I failed to do back then was I didn't disassociate me and my code. If I'd done that, I would have realized that it was my code that was receiving all the comments, and I was just going to be the person to make those changes. So authors, please make sure to remember that you are not your code. And every time you feel like you are, I would say take a break, take a step back, take a deep breath, and get back to the code review probably after some time, after you've told yourself that you're not your code. And once you've done that, once you've gotten back to your code review and you're not your code, make sure to ask the right questions. Maybe a code request suggestion is being made. Make sure to find out why that change request is being made or asked for. Find out how you can make those changes, and if there are examples either in your code base or outside that you could use as reference to make those changes. Again, this is helpful because this will answer all the questions that you might need to have answered as you're making those changes. And this one, again, one of those things that I wish I had realized and used earlier is it is okay to comment on your own code review. You don't have to comment on only code reviews that are being put up by other people on your team. You can also comment on your code reviews. I like to use this specifically for two things. The first one is to ask for suggestions. So for example, if I'm really struggling to come up with a good name for a variable, maybe I put it up for a review, I've tried a bunch of things, and I tell my team what I've tried, and I ask them for suggestions. So I like to say something along the lines of, I'm struggling to come up with a good name for this variable. Does anybody have any suggestions? These are the things I've tried. And again, this opens the door to good conversations. The other thing I like to use this for is to address some of the obvious whys. If my code review is probably breaking pattern with the rest of the code, or if I'm making changes that I know people are going to have questions about, I like to address them. So basically something along the lines of, currently this is not consistent with what we have because we need to update the rest of the code base to follow this pattern. That's the new recommended pattern. And linking out to documentation or whatever I'm referring to in this code review comment is very helpful. I think this is one of those author etiquettes that opens the door to good conversations and good and productive conversations, which is always helpful. And finally, for authors, it's important to make sure that you're getting your review first before you actually hit that button and make a code review, so that your code review is going out the door with one approval. So definitely make sure to get your approval first. And this is a huge time saver. Review your code like you would review anybody else's code on the team. This ensures that you're catching things early on. Maybe there is something obvious that you missed as you were coding, but you can catch them as you're reviewing it. And this saves not just your time, but everybody else's time, because those are things that nobody else will see and maybe call out, and then you have to make changes, and there's time spent there. So make sure to review your code before you put it up for a code review. So on that note, I have reached my list of etiquettes for reviewers, teams, and authors. So I just want to give everybody a quick recap. These were some of the reviewer etiquettes we looked at, and then we moved into some team etiquettes, things that teams could do. And my recommendation would be to have these documented someplace so that everybody can go back and reference these, and some author etiquettes, things that authors can keep in mind to ensure good code review etiquette. Before I actually leave, I want to leave you all with a quote that I thought was very fitting to my talk. I got this from Twitter. I don't know who said it, so if you did, thank you. And please let me know so that I can update these slides. So the quote goes like this. Ask a programmer to review 10 lines of code. They'll find 10 issues. Ask them to do 500 lines, and they'll say it looks good. After I wrote this, I realized that this quote could be, interpreted in a couple of ways. One is make big code reviews so that you get fewer comments. I just want to clarify and say that's not what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying the exact opposite. Make sure to make smaller code reviews so that everything gets reviewed more thoroughly. You're giving people enough time to review things. And above all, make sure to be kind to each other, because our industry definitely needs more of that. And on that note, I've actually reached the end of my talk. Thanks a lot for being here. Thanks a lot for your attention. If you have any questions right now, feel free to ask away. If you have questions come up later on, I am Janani _Subbiah on Twitter. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.